So there are a lot of questions that we want to talk about today, but really, as I said, I see this as an opportunity for a little bit of a masterclass, if you will, to reflect on your extraordinary career. So maybe we can start the conversation just at the highest level. You've had a little bit of time to unwind, relax. Can you give us some reflections, some observations that sort of take in the breadth, the sweep of your career, where you really were at a pivot point through the collapse of the Soviet Union and the run of this advance of the Europol and Free, ending with a tough assignment in Moscow. Can you start at the level of the breadth of your career and giving us a sense of reflections that help frame the conversation we're going to have and are having over these 2 days here in Tbilisi?
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, and for so many of my friends who've made a special effort to come today to listen to me. I want to thank Kurt for inviting me. It's the first time Mariella and I have been back since 2012, and I think most of you who know us know how much we love this country and have how many friends we have. And we've been here for a few days now, and it's been wonderful. And the good news is that people are saying, you got to come back. And I said, yes, we will do it. You know, I've been out of Moscow now and re-retired for about a year. And I've taken some of that time to not only see my kids and grandkids, because we spent 11 of 12 years abroad, and we missed some of our granddaughters' times, and so we're trying to catch up and make up for that. But I've also been trying to take stock of this, what I consider to be a very fortunate and privileged career. Because if you actually go back even before the end of the Soviet Union, I spent 6 years, 2 3-year tours on what was the Soviet desk, and I was the deputy director when the Soviet Union collapsed. Then in the post-Soviet period, of course, I was the deputy chief of mission, the deputy ambassador in Moscow, and then was very fortunate to have these 4 ambassadorial assignments. So trying to look at the perspective, you know, this great strategic inflection point that was the end of the Soviet Union, but whose implications, the changes that have started that day, are still happening today. To try to make some larger sense out of that. And if I write a book or not, I'm not sure, but at least I'll have organized my papers for whoever might want to use some of that stuff when they write the history of this time. I just make one point further on that, and that is that it's hard to kind of see yourself and to see your times in a larger historical context. But I've been reading lately, both going back and rereading George Kennan, and we can talk about that, but I've also been reading a brilliant Ukrainian-American-Canadian historian named Sergei Plokhy, who sees this whole period as the end of empire, and he will draw parallels to the end of empire, the British Empire and the Turkish Empire after World War I, where you have then developing independent states with strong nationalism, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to do an academic lecture, but for those of you who haven't read him, he has a number of really tremendous books. He's been the one who's given me a sense of the larger sweep of where we're going. So maybe within that context we can talk.
All right, so the premise of that is a post-imperial Russia. Yes. And yet it doesn't quite feel like we're through a post-imperial phase with Vladimir Putin.
I used to debate this with some of my Russian friends when I was in Moscow. On this score, I follow particularly Dmitry Trenin, who's the head of the Carnegie Group, who's written books and articles on this, and I think is really the authoritative person. But then there's lots of Russians who will tell you, no, it's not post-imperial, it's neo-imperial. And of course, you can start filling it in there. But I think the more you look at it, and the really smart people who have evaluated not just the Russian actions post-2007 when Putin gave his famous speech in Munich at Verkunda, you see Georgia, lots of people wondered at that point, but then you saw the actions in Ukraine, and you understood, I think, much more clearly what Vladimir Putin and his senior people were trying to accomplish, to restore this, not the Soviet Union, not the ideology of the communist system, but to restore the kind of Russian great power status, despite a lot of other problems, particularly a weak economy, which has gotten weaker as a result of sanctions, trying to recreate some of that world in a sense of pride. Putin does believe that the day that the Soviet Union ended was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of his time.
So you referred to the collapse of the Soviet Union as this great strategic inflection point that you've gone through career-wise. But what has been Putin's inflection point since then that has brought us from the Verkunda speech to the invasion of Georgia to the war in Ukraine today? What has fueled that transformation, evolution of Russian strategy here?
I've always felt that Vladimir Putin was a pragmatist, which doesn't mean he doesn't have some strategic ideas and goals. Clearly, restoring Russia to great power status, and I think we could do a whole seminar on how Putin evolved from the 1999 takeover through the period of the early Bush period, where he was very frustrated that we would not give in on ballistic missile defense, to the U.S. Actions in Iraq, which he did not like. And then you move on further to Medvedev becomes president, and I think some of the articles most of you who have read about how frustrated he was with Medvedev over the abstention on the Libya thing. And then it all, of course, ties in, particularly after he's reelected president in 2012, to his own sense of keeping control. This is why color revolutions are so bad, and you have this kind of nexus between foreign policy and domestic policy. You see the Arab uprisings, you see Yanukovych flee, all of this then feeds this sense of it can't happen at home, and you have then the corresponding exertion of or re-exertion of control over domestic things. Things get much more difficult for people in Russia.
So before you got to Moscow, you obviously were serving in Lithuania, Georgia, Ukraine. How did you see a variation differences in Russian strategy vis-a-vis those neighbors? What was the similarity and the differences in those tours based on Russia's approach?
I'd been in Moscow from 96 to 99, and there was a period of 10 months where I was the chargé. I was in charge of the embassy because Tom Pickering had left and Jim Collins hadn't arrived. And it was in that period that Secretary Albright came and did some of the toughest negotiations with Primakov on the NATO-Russia Founding Act. And Mrs. Albright did a tremendous job. I was in the room, and she worked hard, she was patient, and she tried to knock down some of the Russian stereotypes of what NATO is to try to explain all of the fundamentals of a defensive alliance and the rest of that. And so I'd gone through all of that type of experience, and I'd felt the frustration of not being able to get through to them that the obvious point that the expansion of NATO was not really destined to try to attack Russia or be offensive in any way, but that if they stopped and looked at this, developing a European security system with NATO at its core, but Russia having a good relationship with NATO could in fact enhance their strategic goals and certainly their economic goals. We tried over and over and over again to explain that, but it never got through. The mindset of many of the people there was clear. That then, I remember having these conversations when I was in Lithuania, because we tried to say, listen, the Baltic countries, they're not going to be a threat to you. We're putting an air squadron for their protection, underlying defensive, but they never really accepted that. I think by the time we get to Georgia, you've got a changed Putin or an evolved Putin, so that the statement he made at Verkunda is now starting to put into action. Now, there's a big debate, as you all know, about whether the Bush administration reacted or understood the Russian strategy during that period, and that's for another time. But I think for many of the analysts, certainly for me, when you saw what happened when the annexation Crimea and the bringing in the little green men into the Donbass, it all started to kind of come together. At that point, you have a Russia which is really trying hard to exert itself. You've got not just the Syria efforts being made with the bombing there, but then you have these very close calls of Russian planes intercepting American and other allied NATO aircraft, and it gets much more tense. Ben Hodges knows this stuff as well, or better than anybody, but I think the way I see it, at least, is you've got this evolving attitude by Putin. Anyway, maybe I'll stop at that.
Let me just ask you, I mean, so from your time in those countries, your time in Moscow, how much of a risk taker, you said you thought Vladimir Putin was a pragmatist. How much of a risk taker is he? Why is he willing to take these risks? And what does that mean for the prospects looking forward?
You know, this is one of the things I'm starting to look into. Sunday, I watched on CNN the interview with Fareed Zakaria by John Kerry, who is my boss. And John Kerry, I haven't had a chance to read his new book, which has come out, but he talks apparently in the book as a chapter on Syria, and he speaks quite candidly about his differences with President Obama. He wanted to get some bombing, he wanted to get some no-fly zone or something like that in Syria, which he viewed as a means of getting some leverage, not just on Assad, but also on the Russians and the Iranians. And President Obama would not agree to that. I think the bottom line was the president didn't want to get dragged into another, what he would view as another war in Asia. Now I suspect, and I'm going to just kind of throw this out there, I can't say I've got this all thought through and proved, but I think Mr. Putin kind of analyzed that a little bit and said, okay, I can take advantage of some of this stuff. Now I would just add that the Trump administration, I was very glad to see the attacks by the cruise missiles on the chemical weapons facilities. And I think that we made the right call when the Wagner group, the 300 or 400 mercenaries, tried to make the end run in Syria around the troops and seize the oil at Deir el-Zor. And then we warned them, we talked to them repeatedly, and they kept coming, and we then took out, as I understand it, somewhere between 200 and 300 people. That sent a very clear message as to what the limits are. And I think, as Ben Hodges said, the Russians understand force. Now, I'm not advocating war. I've spent most of my career trying not to do it, but there's times when you have to kind of show that you're not going to allow this to get any further.
So let me focus on U.S. strategy and grand strategy. You pointed out the negotiations that Albright was engaged in on NATO-Russia Founding Act. There's a narrative out there that we just didn't try hard enough in many of these cases to really bring Russia into the post-Cold War security architecture. And yet you were present at some of these negotiations with the Russians on NATO, on missile defense. Is it clear that there was any deal that the Russians, Putin, would have accepted?
I don't think so. I mean, I can't say I was involved in every single discussion, but I certainly heard enough of it. And I think that the people who were in power then, and certainly the leaders of Russian security and foreign policy under President Putin now, are of a type that they just were not ready to really engage with NATO. Now, here again, you get the domestic and the foreign combined, because in order to be able to help maintain legitimacy at home, you have to be able to say there's that foreign enemy out there. And it's pretty hard to be able to say you're going to work with NATO when you have to use that as a means to justify your own domestic situation. It's not an easy thing to parse, but I think the connection there is actually real, and as time goes by, we'll do more research and understand this even better.
It's almost a mirror image in terms of what our strategy had been, that because we were pursuing pretty credibly a strategic partnership with Russia on one track, it gave us the diplomatic muscle to bring Europeans along on NATO enlargement on the other side. We went through an extraordinary part of your career of the advance, the great sweep of advance of a Europe whole and free in what was essentially a benign security environment. So let me bring you to U.S. strategy now. We are no longer in a benign security environment, and General Hodges helped make sure everybody understood that, and that's now reflected. And so that raises a major question about what do we do? What do we do with Georgia? What do we do with Ukraine? Where in 2008, the Bush administration, President Bush, felt so strongly that if they really wanted to be a part of our family, we needed to figure out how to not say no, but figure out how to say yes. But now the circumstances face outright hostility, not ambivalence, certainly not benign. So what does U.S. strategy do? Is Europe whole and free dead? How does that stay alive with Georgia, Ukraine?
You know, I don't think Europe whole, free, and at peace is a dead idea. I still believe in this. Now, some people say, Teft, you're an idealist. I was recently in a discussion where we were talking about how George Shultz, back in the 1980s, when he was advising President Reagan, people, particularly at the Pentagon under Caspar Weinberger, criticized him for being an idealist. But one of our friends who will go unnamed said, no, he was not a realist, he was realistic. He understood the Russians, and he tried to put together a strategy to do it. Now, I will tell you, I've talked to a lot of my friends since I came back from Moscow, and I haven't come up with a realistic strategy to get us to Europe free, whole, and at peace. Now, will this take, the post-Putin period? It's really hard to tell. We've tried very hard, and of course, we now have some complications, serious complications with cyber attacks, poison attacks in Britain, which have made things even worse. But most of all, the Russian actions have really undercut, certainly in the United States, the whole fabric for finding some common ground on things. So even if, diplomats were able to come up with some kind of strategy or something, I don't think we'd have the kind of support, certainly in the United States, in our Congress, and even among the American people. People are pretty frustrated about cyber attacks, and then they watch the pictures that the BBC shows of these two guys poisoning the Skripals and showing them at every step. For that matter, in Ukraine, they watch, what's it called, Bellingcat, and you can watch a video that will show you exactly the missile truck that brings in the missile that shoots down the Dutch or the Malaysian aircraft.
So the strategy is not the one we've enjoyed over the past 20 years. That's clear. Even if a vision is same, the strategy is different. How would you critique, rather than a post-Cold War strategy that we've seen, partnership allowing for enlargement, more of a Truman-esque strategy? In the 1950s, the Turkish Strait crisis, the Soviets probing in Turkey, Greece reeling out of the Civil War, the Truman administration made a brazen bilateral security commitment to Greece, Turkey, and then very quickly brought them into NATO, bringing NATO up to the border of the Soviet Union at a time when the Soviets were on offense, when we were bogged down in a war breaking out in Korea. What would happen today if we had a slightly crazy president that was willing to take that kind of move? What would that precipitate out of Moscow? A rapid decision, first bilateral NATO for a country like Georgia?
It's hard to say, because in Moscow, the decision is made by one man. I have a good friend who was an analyst of the Politburo in the 70s and the 80s, and he retired a few years ago, but he said, it's so much harder to understand what Russian strategy is today, because instead of getting a Politburo decision on Thursday at a meeting and having it published in Izvestia on Friday, and then 2 or 3 different analyses over the weekend, you could kind of triangulate and figure out what they were really trying to do. Today, the man who is making all those decisions is sitting there, and he doesn't even tell his own people what he's trying to do. So it's pretty hard to kind of sort through these things. I think we've got some very good people who are trying to kind of do this, but this is why I've supported having meetings like when President Trump met with Putin, because the only way you're going to kind of get some of this and understand it is to actually talk to the man himself.
Well, Helsinki was a sensational gathering, so we've heard a lot about Trump on Putin, but what about Putin on Trump? How does the Kremlin actually understand President Trump, his rhetoric combined with what is arguably extremely strong policy standing up to Russia? How does this, what are the calculations?
So you want me to be Washingtonologist, not a Kremlinologist at this point, or a White Houseologist. When I was ambassador in Moscow, I took very seriously our Hatch Act. This is the law that prohibits federal employees from engaging in any kind of campaign. And I took it to mean that we would not get involved with any campaign. If Hillary Clinton had sent somebody, or if Trump sent someone, as we now know they did, we didn't have any contact with them. So I don't know more about that. When Carter Page came or General Flynn came, we didn't have any relationship with them. I suspect today that there's a certain amount of reluctance. This is just a personal assessment about President Trump in Moscow. In this sense, they may have had hopes, and there may be other things there I don't know about. But the fact is that he had this meeting. He put forward a lot of proposals, and there may be some that are being discussed among staffs at the NSC and the Security Council and the Foreign Ministry. But the way the president portrayed these in his press conference so antagonized people in the United States and in Europe that in effect it kind of vitiated and undercut the whole basis. And instead of improving the situation even moderately, it's probably make things worse. And the Russians understand finally that that in America, it really is a democracy. In Europe, it really is a democracy. And you've got to have that base if you're going to get any support. And as the general pointed out earlier, the numbers on both sanctions votes and other things in the United States indicate clearly how bipartisan the opposition is to moving forward with Russia, given the things they've done.
98-2. I'm going to close by taking a couple of questions from the audience at the same time. I'll start in the front row and go back into the middle. So, our second row here, please. And then we'll go to the middle. Let me take them together. Brief questions, please, for the ambassador.
Thank you very much. I'll try to speak loudly. Hello?
It's the KGB.
Yeah. So my name is Georgi Oniani. I'm with TI Georgia. First of all, thank you very much for everything you've done for the country and for the region. I mean, we really appreciate that. Two very short questions.
Brief.
First of all, what do you think should take place for Russia not to hold the so-called veto power for Georgia's NATO membership? This is one. And secondly, do you see a potential of some change in Russia? Because, as you said, Putin is there since 1999, and there is the whole generation brought up who is seeing only one leader. I mean, and they're traveling around the world, they're seeing what the democracy is, and there might be a kind of a fatigue there. So do you think that's enough to change the regime in any way?
And let me grab the question in the middle of this gentleman there, right in the center.
My name is Valery Chechelashvili, Rondeli Foundation. Mr. Ambassador, first of all, thank you very much for all great things you have done to Georgia during your diplomatic mission in Tbilisi. My question is, did the Lithuanian, Georgian, and Ukrainian experience help you to understand the nature of Russian regime? And did it contribute to your vision how to oppose threats generated in Moscow? Thank you.
And is there a final question from a woman in the audience? I did not see a woman asking. Yes, in the back, please.
Way in the back.
Thank you. And that's the final question. If you could take the microphone to the back, please.
Thank you. Eto Buzeshvili. I have two short questions. The first one, what do you think, why did Russia underestimate the resilience of Ukrainian statehood? And the second question...
Say it again.
Why did Russia underestimate the resilience of Ukrainian statehood? And the second question is, do you think that, can the fear of failing in Ukraine make Russia think about taking more harsh steps? Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to start from the last one and then work back, and he's going to remind me if I can't remember them. You know, not long ago, I was introduced at a conference. It was a nice introduction. He said, you know, this guy has forgotten more about Russia than most of us know. And I thought to myself, man, does he know how right he is? I've forgotten everything. I think I think it's been mentioned already. In 2008, you remember at the Bucharest summit, the dinner where President Bush and President Putin are there, and somebody leaves the mic on, and Putin says, you know, Ukraine is not a state. And I mean, we've seen this repeated over and over again. And I think this is one of the fundamental problems among President Putin and his people. They just, I think what he said, we're all one people. Well, the actions that they took from 2014 on have really broken that in so many ways. And you know, I used to have friends in Moscow who'd say to me that, you know, the thing we do on Sunday dinner or Friday Shabbat dinner, we don't talk about Ukraine because inevitably we end up fighting. Now, this isn't just people who have Ukrainian relatives. This is people, Russians who have different views about this. I think that there are a lot of people in Russia, including among the elites, who are now understanding what Dmitry Trenin wrote back in March, that in fact the whole Ukraine annexation and the way Russia treated Ukraine was a mistake. You know, when I was the ambassador in Ukraine, when Mariella and I arrived in 2009, there were only 24% of the population who supported NATO membership. When I left in 2013, it was still about 24%. Today, it's 60-something, what happened. And I would say this to my friends in Russia. I'd say, what happened? You know, what do you think you've done? And I think most of you know, you follow the situation in Ukraine carefully. There's been this huge, how shall I say, negative fallout among the Ukrainian people. I mean, one of the big issues now is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is going to be granted autocephaly. You know, that may not have happened. I mean, look at these consequences, is what I'm trying to say, of what the Russian actions from 2014 on have been. And I think there is a realization there. Now, again, given the system, you're not going to see, I think, urgent changes, although I keep hearing from different people that there is discussion even in the senior levels. I don't think there's going to be a withdrawal from Crimea under Putin. That's a linchpin of his action. But I'm hopeful that Kurt Volker will get engaged with Mr. Surkov and will actually start moving forward to try to find an implementation of the Minsk principles or whatever else. Now,
and I think the last set of questions relate, and you can use this to bring our conversation to a close. From your experiences, the nature of the Russian regime, the prospects for change in Russia, how to avoid a veto over...
Okay, I'll get to that. I forgot one other point I wanted to make, which was those of you who were here listening to Zygis Pavilonis, he said something very important for all Georgians. And he said, to paraphrase him, soon Linus Linkevičius and I is going to be here talking to you. We've been kind of on the opposite sides, foreign policy and politics, and yet the bottom line was we support our country and its main objectives, which have always been getting into the EU and NATO and being a responsible partner. Now, I understand, I live in a country that's as polarized as I've ever seen it, but follow the example of the Lithuanians here in Georgia. Fight like crazy in politics, but remember that the nation, and especially a small country on the border with this great big country, you know, you really need a sense of unity. And I know that's easier said than done, but I think it's there. Long term, And I think all of your friends, all of the people here from the United States and Europe, all feel that same sense. They want you to, work through your problems, but to remember there's one Georgia, and Georgia has made a lot of achievements, but needs to do more. Last point, then, is the prospects for the future. I've always believed that the system in Russia under Putin was more fragile than people, sometimes analysts, realized. In particular, an example, I thought that, if we ever did move to pension age reform, you'd see a pretty fast reaction, and you've seen it. Not only do you have demonstrations out there, but the drop in the Levada polls for Mr. Putin are really quite clear. I also have felt that some of these articles that you read in the Western press about the monolithic support of Putin by young people, it's just not true. Yes, there's lots of Nashi, and Vladimir knows these things better than I do, but I've been struck, and Marielle and I traveled all over in Russia, and everywhere we went, we found people, they weren't necessarily opponents of Mr. Putin, but they wanted a country that was open to the West. They wanted a country where they could realize their dreams of travel and prospects. And I'll close with just a short vignette. I remember on June 12th of last year when Mr. Navalny organized through social media a set of demonstrations. I think it was like 87 or 88 cities. It surprised us at the embassy, surprised the Kremlin, how many people turned out. There was an interview in Kommersant that next day. A young woman who's 20 years old from a very good family who was at Moscow State University had been arrested on Tverskaya Street with a bunch of other demonstrators. And the journalist had asked her, why would you risk everything for so much, for, all that you have going for you for this? And she said, I don't see where my country is going. I don't see any perspective here. I see a leadership that is just intent on keeping things the way it is and making more money for themselves. This is not the Russia that I want to see as I grow older and become a part of this society. It's one person, I understand, but I think it represents a broader view among a lot of people there, and it made a big impression on me, which is why I tell you the story.
That's a great way to end the conversation. Whenever we hear about great geopolitics of people wanting to determine the future of this region, they always forget the power and agency of the people here themselves. We've seen that here in Tbilisi, we've seen it in Kyiv, and we will see it in Moscow as well. So please join me in thanking Ambassador Teff for a fantastic conversation. Really appreciate it.
And thank you, Damon. Great job, John. Thank you.